the grand, violent theater of World War II, the tank became an icon of power. When we think of that power, our minds often jump to the German Panther, the Soviet T-34, or the American Sherman. These were machines defined by a balance of speed, protection, and firepower. But in the opening acts of the war, Britain marched to the beat of a different drum, championing a strange and stubborn concept: the infantry tank. This wasn't a cavalry charger meant to dash across the plains. This was a walking fortress, a steel behemoth designed to do one thing: survive. And the ultimate expression of this idea was a tank so tough, so obstinate that for a brief, glorious moment, it was the most feared vehicle on Earth. This is the story of the A-12 Infantry Tank Mark II, better known as the Matilda II. The story of the Matilda II really begins with its rather unfortunate older sibling. In the mid-1930s, the British War Office, obsessed with the grinding trench warfare of the last war, wanted a tank that could escort infantry across no man's land. It needed to be immune to machine guns and small anti-tank weapons, and its speed was secondary. The result was the A-11, the Infantry Tank Mark I. It was a tiny two-man machine with a single heavy machine gun, thick armor for its day, and a comical waddle that led its creator, General Hugh Ells, to remark that it reminded him of Matilda the Duck, a popular cartoon character of the time. The name stuck. But while the Matilda Mark I was tough, it was severely undergunned and mechanically questionable. The Army knew they needed something much, much better. So, in 1936, even as the first Matilda was being prototyped, work began on a proper infantry tank, a Matilda Senior. Designated the A-12, the project was handed to the Vulcan Foundry in Warrington. The design brief was simple but demanding. It had to carry a cannon capable of killing any other tank. It needed armor that could defeat any known anti-tank gun, and it should be powered by reliable, commercially available engines. Speed was once again at the bottom of the list. What they produced was a masterpiece of defiance. The Matilda II was not a revolution in design, but an evolution in sheer brute force. It was a statement in steel, a 27-ton middle finger to enemy firepower. To understand why the Matilda II was so formidable, you have to look at its anatomy. This was not a tank, it was a land battleship. The hull was a complex assembly of massive cast steel sections bolted together, a method that produced an incredibly resilient structure. Its frontal armor was 78 millimeters thick. Its sides weren't much thinner, at 65 to 70 millimeters. Even the turret was a single, colossal steel casting with 75 millimeters of protection all around. In a time when the standard German anti-tank gun, the Pak-36, could barely handle 30 millimeters of armor, the Matilda was in a different league entirely. It was, for all intents and purposes, impenetrable. Inside this fortress sat a crew of 4. A commander, a gunner, a loader, and a driver. The main weapon they served was the Ordnance quick-firing 2-pounder. This was a 40-millimeter cannon that, in 1940, was one of the best anti-tank guns in the world. It fired a solid armor-piercing shot at high velocity, capable of punching clean through any German panzer it faced. However, it had a colossal, almost war-defining flaw. It had no high-explosive, or HE, shell. This meant the Matilda II was superb at killing other tanks, but was shockingly ineffective against soft targets. It couldn't efficiently take out enemy anti-tank gun crews, machine gun nests, or infantry positions. It could only pepper them with machine gun fire or try, somewhat pathetically, to hit them with a solid metal slug. It was a flaw that would come to haunt the tank throughout its career. For secondary armament, it carried a single 7.92 millimeter Besa machine gun, a fantastic weapon that was mounted coaxially with the main cannon. Getting this 27-ton beast moving was a challenge. To save time and money, the designers opted for 2 standard AEC 6-cylinder bus engines, linked together to a single drive shaft. These were reliable diesel engines, which was a huge bonus, as diesel fuel is far less flammable than gasoline, a fact that Matilda crews came to greatly appreciate. But combined, they produced only 190 horsepower. This gave the Matilda a stately top speed of about 15 miles per hour, or 24 kilometers per hour, on a good road. Off-road, it was often crawling along at a walking pace, which was exactly what the infantry tank doctrine called for. Its suspension, a complex system of bogies and bell cranks based on a Vickers design sold to Japan, gave it a stable ride, but would later prove to be a maintenance headache and vulnerable to mud and debris. When war broke out in 1939, Britain had only 2 Matilda IIs in service. But by the time the German war machine smashed into France and the Low Countries in May of 1940, a handful of them had reached the British Expeditionary Force, or BEF. They were about to get their trial by fire. As the BEF was pushed back towards the sea by the relentless blitzkrieg, a desperate counterattack was planned near the town of Arras. The goal was to strike the flank of the German advance, disrupt their momentum, and buy time for the retreating armies. On May 21, 1940, a mixed force of British and French tanks, spearheaded by just 58 Matilda IIs of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment, rolled forward. They slammed directly into the flank of General Erwin Rommel's 7th Panzer Division. What happened next was a moment of pure shock and disbelief for the so-called masters of tank warfare. Rommel's panzers and his anti-tank gun crews opened fire, and nothing happened. Their 37mm shells simply ricocheted off the Matilda's thick hides, sparking like pebbles thrown against a castle wall. The German soldiers, who had known nothing but victory, were terrified. They called the Matildas invincible iron monsters. The British tanks lumbered forward, their 2-pounder guns methodically punching holes in Panzer IIIs and IVs, their machine guns raking the German lines. For a few hours, the Matilda was unstoppable. Rommel himself was caught in the chaos, and his frantic reports speak of a deep crisis. He wrote that his guns were not effective against these heavily armored beasts. Out of sheer desperation, Rommel ordered his division's heavy support weapons into the line. These included 105mm field howitzers and, most famously, the 88mm anti-aircraft flak guns. By lowering the barrels of these massive guns and firing them directly at the advancing tanks, the Germans finally found a weapon that could kill a Matilda. The high-velocity 88mm shell was one of the few things capable of piercing that 78mm armor plate. The Battle of Arras was not a strategic victory for the Allies. The attack was eventually halted, and the retreat to Dunkirk continued. But it sent a seismic shockwave through the German high command. It was the first time their blitzkrieg had been seriously checked, and it was done by a slow, stubborn tank that simply refused to die. Most of the Matildas used at Arras never made it back to Britain. Like the rest of the BEF's heavy equipment, they were abandoned on the shores of France. But they had proven their point. While the fields of France smoldered, the Matilda's greatest chapter was about to begin in a new theater of war. The vast, scorching expanse of North Africa. Shipped to Egypt, the Matilda II found an environment perfectly suited to its strengths. The wide-open terrain of the desert meant engagements often happened at long range, where the Matilda's thick armor gave it a huge advantage. Its first major test came in late 1940 during Operation Compass, a massive British offensive against the Italian forces in Libya. The Italian tanks of the day, the M1139 and M1340, were lightly armored and completely outclassed. Their guns were simply incapable of harming the Matilda. The result was a slaughter. The Matildas would advance slowly and deliberately under artillery fire, shrugging off hits that would have annihilated other tanks, before closing the distance and methodically destroying the Italian armor with their 2-pounder guns. The infantry, who had once been skeptical of these slow-moving machines, now saw them as their saviors. It was here, amidst the dust and heat of the desert, that the Matilda II earned its immortal nickname. The Queen of the Desert. For a time it reigned supreme. It was the undisputed master of the battlefield, a symbol of British imperial power that seemed just as unstoppable as it had at Arras. But the Queen's reign was destined to be a short one. The crushing defeat of their Italian allies forced the Germans to intervene. In early 1941, Erwin Rommel arrived in Africa, this time with his newly formed Deutsches Afrika Korps, and he had remembered the lesson from Arras. The Afrika Korps was equipped with new, more powerful 50mm PaK-38 anti-tank guns, which could, at close range, find a weak spot in the Matilda's armor. More importantly, Rommel integrated his 88mm flak guns into his defensive screens as a matter of standard doctrine. He would use his lighter panzers to lure the British tanks into a carefully prepared trap, a cauldron of concealed anti-tank guns. The Matildas, believing they were advancing on vulnerable panzers, would rumble straight into the killing zone. Suddenly, the Queen of the Desert was vulnerable. Her armor, once her greatest strength, was no longer enough. At the same time, the fatal flaw of her 2-pounder gun became glaringly obvious. Without a high explosive round, the Matildas struggled to suppress the German anti-tank gun crews, who were now their deadliest predators. The Desert War was evolving, and the Matilda was beginning to be left behind. Just as its star was fading in the west, the Matilda was given a surprising second act on the war's most brutal stage, the Eastern Front. With the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, Britain began sending vast amounts of military aid, and among the supplies were hundreds of Matilda II tanks. Over 900 were eventually shipped via the perilous Arctic convoys. For the Red Army soldiers, who were used to their own revolutionary T-34, the Matilda was a strange machine. They praised its incredibly thick armor, which they found was still effective against most German guns in 1941 and 1942. They also noted its relative crew comfort and the reliability of its diesel engines, but they were scathing in their criticism of its mobility. The complex suspension and narrow tracks were a nightmare in the thick mud of the Russian Rasputitsa and the deep snow of its winter. The tracks were easily clogged and thrown, and the tank's low speed made it a sluggish target on the vast steppes. The Soviets also despised the 2-pounder gun. They couldn't understand why a heavy tank had a cannon that couldn't fire a useful high-explosive shell, making it almost useless for the kind of combined arms infantry support they specialized in. Despite these flaws, the Matilda served with distinction in some of the most titanic clashes in history, including the defense of Moscow and the colossal Battle of Kursk. Often dug in as mobile pillboxes or used in deliberate, heavily supported assaults, the Matilda, known to the Soviets simply as the Mk2, continued to fight on, a stubborn British exile in a foreign war. The Matilda's final chapter of combat would be written even further from home, under the command of Australian troops in the Pacific Theater. In the dense, humid jungles of New Guinea and Borneo, the dynamics of tank warfare were completely different. Speed was irrelevant, and engagements were often brutal, close-range affairs. Here, the Matilda's thick armor once again proved invaluable against Japanese anti-tank weapons, which were generally less powerful than their German counterparts. The Australians became masters of adapting the Matilda to this new environment. They developed several fascinating local modifications. The most famous was the Matilda Frog, a terrifying flamethrower tank capable of clearing out heavily fortified Japanese bunkers and trench systems. Another variant, the Matilda Hedgehog, mounted a naval spigot mortar on its rear deck. This fired 7 65-pound, 29-kilogram projectiles in a pattern designed to blast apart enemy fortifications from a safe distance. In the Pacific, the old Queen of the Desert found a new purpose, not as a tank killer, but as a jungle-busting battering ram, serving faithfully until the very last day of the war. By 1942, in Europe and North Africa, the Matilda II was clearly obsolete. Its fundamental design limitations had caught up with it. Its slow speed made it unable to keep up with the faster-paced, more fluid battles of the mid-war period. Its small, 3-man turret had a tiny turret ring, which made it physically impossible to upgrade the main gun to a larger caliber cannon like the 6-pounder or the 75mm gun that were becoming standard. The lack of a high-explosive shell for its 2-pounder remained an unforgivable weakness. Production ceased in 1943 after about 987 tanks had been built. It was gradually replaced in British service by more balanced and versatile machines. The Valentine infantry tank, though smaller, could be upgunned. The new Churchill tank carried on the heavy armor philosophy, but with a much larger chassis and greater potential. And, of course, the tide was turned by the thousands of American-made M3 Grant and M4 Sherman tanks that poured in through Lend-Lease, bringing with them the 75mm gun that could fire both effective armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds. The story of the Matilda II is a story of temporary, brilliant, and brutal supremacy. It was a tank born from a defensive, almost fearful doctrine that, for a short time, became one of the most aggressive and dominant weapons on the planet. It terrified the seemingly invincible German army in France. It ruled the sands of North Africa as its queen, and it found a second life fighting in the mud of Russia and the jungles of the Pacific. It was slow, it was undergunned, and it was a strategic dead end. But it was also tough, reliable, and for the soldiers who fought against it, it was a monster. For the men who fought inside it, it was their fortress. It was the right tank at the right time, a steel wall that bought the Allies precious time when they needed it most, and in the process, carved its name into legend. The Matilda II is a perfect example of how a piece of military hardware can be both a master of its era and a victim of progress. Its story is one of incredible highs and frustrating lows. And we want to know what you think. Could a better gun have kept the Matilda relevant for longer? Or was its slow speed always a fatal flaw? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments. We're always on the lookout for the next piece of military history to investigate. So if there's a legendary machine, a forgotten battle, or an unsung hero you think deserves the spotlight, drop your mission briefing for us below. Your idea might just become our next deep dive. And if you enjoyed this journey into the world of the Queen of the Desert, make sure you are subscribed and have notifications turned on so you don't miss our next expedition into the annals of warfare.